Have you ever wondered why so many people are leaving churches in America and what this means for faith and culture? And if you're curious about the largest religious shift in our nation's history and its implications for the future, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing The Great Dechurching by Jim Davis and Michael Graham. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're diving into a fascinating and a challenging book, The Great Dechurching. Jim Davis and Michael Graham provide a thoughtful and, importantly, a data-driven look at why millions of Americans have left the church in recent decades and what this means for our society and what might come next. I will point out that Jim Davis and Michael Graham, they are some kind of pastors, I mean, they belong to a mainstream Protestant sect, and that is certainly the focus of this and some discussion of Catholicism. They don't really get into any other major religions, although I will say a lot of what they talk about in here certainly can be applied to religion in general. Every faith in America is facing either at the best stagnation or significant decline in its numbers. Although this book is focused on mainline Protestant faiths for the most part, because I think that they have seen the most dramatic decline in their numbers. And I think that one of the great values in this book is the fact that it is data driven and it certainly digs into a lot of the information. I have to say that I didn't personally go and explore all of that data individually, so I don't know if they used the best methodology, although they did work with professionals to come up with that. But I will say at the heart of this book that it is certainly about a question of faith. So the two people that wrote it, they are most interested in answering faith-based concerns and not just answering, broader trends in not just the lack of religion in America, but in a general trend towards lack of organizations and, playing off that concept of bowling alone that has become a really well-known phenomenon in the last couple decades, especially since the pandemic. The authors framed their book, The Great Dechurching, as a historic shift. Over 40 million Americans have left their churches since the 1990s, and again, predominantly mainline Protestant and Catholic faiths. And I mean, this makes for the largest religious change in all of American history. I think, well, obviously, in sheer numbers, 40 million is a colossal number, but also in percentages as well. And the book isn't just about the numbers, though. I mean, it also really uses stories to help emphasize all of the main points that they're trying to address. And so Davis and Graham, they explore the various motivations behind why people leave, and they question whether it's burnout or disillusionment with leadership. That is certainly a big one of the issues, or a cultural drift away from organized religion, generally speaking. I would say one of the strengths of it is its reliance on thorough research. And I got the impression based off of what I read and saw that they were very careful to only draw conclusions that a professional researcher would also draw. And like I said, they then do take that and ask larger questions about faith. And there is a good deal of, we'll say, sermonizing within the book. Not that that's necessarily a put off, but if you're looking for a strictly sociological shift in America, then this may not be the book for you. But if you are looking at someone's interpretation and trying to do it with just raw data, I certainly think that you could get something out of this regardless of your religious background. The authors focus on what they identify as essentially three main demographic groups and why they have left the church. So they talk about, first of all, cultural Christians. So those would be people who grew up in the church but never really embraced its teachings. They talk about convictional Christians. So those would be devoted believers who leave due to something else, such as burnout or maybe church conflict or a perceived lack of spiritual nourishment. I found that probably to be one of the most interesting groups that they looked at. And then there are the deconverted Christians, and these are individuals who lose faith altogether and often identify as atheist or agnostic. I found this an incredibly fascinating group too, because I think that there's the perception that frequently people go off to college or university, and it's there that they suddenly lose their faith and leave their church. And that actually does not bear out in the statistics. Going to college and getting more education is actually going to leave you more likely to stay active in your faith. It is the people that do not go on to get higher education that are leaving the church at a higher rate. And I think that was one thing that really surprised people, especially since I believe throughout the mid 1900s, the mid 20th century up to the early, well, I guess the late 20th century, the trend was the other way around, that the more educated someone was, the less likely they were to be religious, with a few exceptions. And I would say that that was one of the major shifts in the trends that really surprised me and seemed to surprise them as well. And so this book, I mean, it strives to really get into the numbers and to discuss, the social and cultural factors behind this trend. And they have a lot of different possibilities. They certainly think that things like increased individualism is certainly a possibility. There is a distrust in institutions that, again, is not just necessarily related to churches, but just broadly speaking, a renewed distrust of institutions, whether that is faith-based or university systems or government systems, or just really almost any institution seems to be up for criticism. And then this idea of the rise of secularism, which certainly has had a notable trend in the last couple decades. And that one is a little harder to fully understand why that might be the case, but it is certainly something that they try to explore. One of the big questions the book addresses is whether this dechurching is permanent, or if people are likely to return. And the authors emphasize that while some are done with church for good, they believe that others might come back if the church, and they say the church broadly speaking, that is, of course, essentially meaning mainline Protestant faiths and kind of Catholicism. They sometimes lump Catholicism in with that, and sometimes they are clear to make distinctions. But they believe that it's important that the collectively speaking, the churches can address these key issues, such as restoring trust in leadership, especially after scandals. That has been a huge reason for why people lose their faith or stop going to church. They also think that making church a place for genuine community and belonging is something that needs to be focused on. And I think that there is certainly a lot of questions of how much politics has, I don't want to say has infiltrated religion. I think politics has always been there. It just seems to be creating a more stark division in the last couple of decades that has, again, given people justification for why they would or would not go to church. And I think that also can be applied to all sorts of things within our greater society that apply to questions of LGBTQ rights, or how other marginalized communities might be treated. And I think that is certainly a major part of what they are getting at. And then they also think that it's really important that the church collectively finds some way of addressing the tension between tradition and modern culture. I mean, that's just a fundamental issue that they don't think that the church has fully addressed, and that is one reason why a lot of people are saying that they no longer want to go to churches. They just don't feel like the church has any real value, even if they consider themselves spiritual, because the church does not address this tension between tradition and modernity. Then they just don't feel like they can connect with church anymore, and it doesn't provide that spiritual nourishment that they are seeking. Of course, another theme is the church's response, or the lack of response to all these various trends. And so the authors call for some self-reflection. They are pretty blunt about calling on some repentance from the church and its leaders, and of course innovations to make the church relevant in today's world without compromising its core mission. And that is a big part of the final third or quarter of the book, is discussing what is the church's core mission. And there is a good deal of debate for that. I would say that these authors tend to paint a much broader and what I felt to be a pretty encompassing idea of what the church's core mission should be, in terms of helping people, obviously as Christians, they specifically believe come unto Christ, but I would say even more broadly speaking, to come to an acceptance and some kind of belief in a higher being, and how that should affect us in our day-to-day life and help us in building spirituality and interacting with the people around us, and not just our family members, but our larger community as a whole. So who is this book for? Well, I would say if you're a church leader, and not necessarily just a pastor But if you're any kind of church leader, whether that's a teacher or just someone that's just curious about the future of religion in America and trying to understand some of these larger divisions that are very prominent and very noticeable in the world at the moment, I certainly think you could get a lot out of this book. I will say that they are clearly religious, even though I think their analysis and their understanding of the data is pretty straightforward, and I think they do a good job of showing how they're being analytical. But on the flip side of that, there is also a good deal of the book, like I said, especially the last third or quarter or so, where they're less emphasized on what the data has shown them, and they are more focused on actually addressing what the purpose of religion is. And so there's certainly going to be a much more religious tone and certainly a Christian tone, which they are pursuing. So if that is not something that you want to engage with, then maybe this book isn't for you. Or if you could just keep that in the back of your mind, if you want to engage with the larger conversation that they are being a part of, then this book is going to be for you. Who is this not for? Well, if you have no interest in understanding this major political and religious shift in American life, then maybe this just doesn't appeal to you. Or if any of the reasons I said why people are leaving their faith did not seem like this book would address that, then maybe this book is not for you either. And like I've said several times now, if you think that the fact that they're coming clearly from a Christian perspective is going to be a challenge to you, then again, this book may not be for you. But I will say overall, I found it a very thoughtful book. Even though I don't come from the same religious background as the authors, I certainly appreciated what they had to say. And I at no point was offended or frustrated with what they were saying. Even if I didn't have the exact same beliefs as them, I certainly could see where they were coming from. And I could see above all that they were trying to be thoughtful and inclusive in their discussion and their argument and trying to make room for more people in the church. And I don't just mean that in the broadest sense, but also literally coming into the church and feeling a place of community. And I do think that there is considerable value in that conversation, especially since we are seeing such a dramatic shift. And so I would encourage anyone to pick up this book if they have questions about that trend. But I would also love to hear what you guys have to say about this book, or if you have any other suggestions that deal with this subject. I have already referenced once the idea of bowling alone, which is not exactly about dechurching, but it certainly does deal with this idea of people no longer being drawn to large organizations. I'm sure there's a lot of literature out there, but I would love any suggestions that people have about this trend in American society. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, thank you for watching. I greatly appreciate all of your support. As a reminder, I've just recently launched another channel, History Unraveled with Dr. Duncan. You can find a link to it in the description. Please go check that out if that sounds remotely interesting to you. Also, I have recently launched a Patreon for this channel. Please check that out. I greatly appreciate any way that anybody can help support this channel so I can bring you more videos and more reviews so we can keep talking about books. And as always, until next time, keep those pages turning.